What is up, Bitcoiners? It's CK, and I have another great episode of the Bitcoin Magazine podcast for you. I sat down with the legend BSG, Christian Langalis, the man behind one of the greatest Bitcoin memes in history, the Buy Bitcoin Behind Janet Yellen moment and photo. It is absolutely legendary, and Christian is one of the best Bitcoiners out there. I've had the pleasure of being his friend, and this was my first in-person podcast in over a year. I've been doing these pods over Zoom for so long, and it was really, really refreshing to sit down with Christian in person, chat, talk about everything that he's doing to further Bitcoin, further sovereignty, and further self-hosted servers and personal computing. This podcast, we dive into everything from, the man behind the meme to, how Christian got into the Bitcoin space and what Christian is doing in order to help people run and use computing services that do not rely on middlemen. He is trying to protocolize the internet with Urbit over at Tlon, and they are building around Bitcoin, which is really exciting. We talk about the ins and outs on what Urbit is, how people can interact with it, why people should use it, and why Bitcoin is the impetus of the personal computing revolution and the personal server revolution, and how Urbit is leveraging Bitcoin in order to create infrastructure that is really easy and approachable for users and developers alike. This was a great episode, and both Christian as well as the Tlon team are going to be at Bitcoin 2021. I need to tell you guys, you need to get your ticket to this conference absolutely right now. Do not wait. Get your tickets before prices go up. Get your tickets before we sell out. We sell anywhere from 50 to 100 tickets a day, and we have a hard cap on how many people we can fit into this building. Obviously, there is limited capacity because of coronavirus restrictions and stuff like that. So if you want to come to Bitcoin 2021, get your ticket today. Go to b.tc/conference and get your ticket using promo code Satoshi. That promo code will save you 10% off. You can see Tony Hawk, you can see Nick Szabo, you can see Chamath, you can see Michael Saylor, Jack Dorsey, and a lot of other heavyweights in the Bitcoin space. Guys, this is going to be the conference of a decade. This is going to be the best Bitcoin and the biggest Bitcoin conference in history. So don't miss it. Promo code Satoshi, b.tc. All right, let's get into this podcast with the famous Bitcoin sign guy. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to keep that in the recording. All right, guys, Bitcoiners, I'm sitting across in person for the first time in over a year for an in-flesh Bitcoin Magazine podcast. I'm sitting across from another Christian Langalis, the famed Bitcoin sign guy. Welcome to the show.
It's good to be here, man. Thank you for having me.
So, Christian, a lot of people listening to this podcast are pretty well known with like your initial moment of fame. And, let's just call it your cannonball into the Bitcoin community. I wanted to start off the podcast, just by kind of talking about that moment. It was in 2017, and the world has really changed a lot since then. But do you want to kind of just like give the audience a kind of quick play-by-play of the famous Bitcoin sign guy moment?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, it certainly was not intended to be famous. It was just sort of an image that I wanted to have. I was going to take the screenshot from the replay later, but, it was completely unintended that it went viral with the Bitcoin community. I suppose I should have known. But anyway, yeah, it's been coming up on 4 years, I guess, and well, the investment thesis has played out.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, my dad doesn't have to be embarrassed at cocktail parties now when he asks if his son is like still into Bitcoin. So it's good.
Hey, parents are proud of Bitcoin these days. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
My parents sure are.
Parents might even be getting into the Bitcoin industry these days. It's funny how that works.
Yeah, it really is. So, I mean, again, just to kind of verbally kind of walk through the moment, what was happening in 2017 when, you kind of saw your opportunity to get on camera?
Well, it was one of those, the biannual Humphrey Hawkins testimony where the Fed has to answer questions from members of Congress, and Yellen was being interviewed by, I forget his name. It was, I think, Senator Bill Posey, about the transparency of the Federal Reserve. So, I saw sort of a moment of irony and took it. But, that's just the nature of these large bureaucratic systems that demand, these large public spectacles, because it's as much about the Fed as it is about the Congress members being able to get in their punch for their constituency. So, the theater of it is, an exploitable surface.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, talking about like the theater of official government stuff, we've been kind of seeing a ton of that in the news recently around impeaching Trump, around the procedures, kind of with everything kind of presidential. It really does feel like there's this theatrical component to all of it. I've been calling it clown world, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, you can call it clown world, or I guess you could say that it's part of, and not to immediately relapse onto this, what's become sort of a crutch of a word, but simulated reality, where reality is trafficked through these official events or official models. We're here in San Francisco, and my girlfriend, who's a teacher, they're saying, oh, well, we're in the red tier, so now we can start bringing some students back into the school building. And so it's more about how there are models, sort of abstract models, that completely striate and posture conversations about current events. And then sometimes they have, because they're sort of rigid in that way, they're vulnerable to acts of arbitrary terror, I guess, or just capricious behavior.
So, I mean, would you consider the Bitcoin sign guy moment as capricious behavior or an act of terror kind of?
Yeah, I mean, not to say that it's too much, not to ascribe more to it than what it was intended for. But I guess, if it is effectively that, if the Fed goes to the hearing expecting the headlines that come out of it to be about the monetary policy that they're setting forward, and if suddenly the headlines are changed to some Bitcoin radical was in the room, and he's able to shift the conversation to Bitcoin, then I think that that's a certain act of disruption, or it's not quite throwing a bomb into a cafe, but it's similarly disruptive to the official process and the official manufacture of meaning through these events and systems.
I mean, okay, maybe it's not throwing a bomb into a cafe physically, but from an intellectual discourse perspective, it probably had a pretty similar effect.
Well, I guess I hope. I hope. I mean, Bitcoin, I don't think that Bitcoin is really, it's not anything that any individual at this point could meaningfully stop. So I guess the corollary to that is there's nothing that an individual could do to meaningfully further Bitcoin on their own. So I don't know, maybe that's a controversial statement to make, but I think that that's just the nature of singularity itself. Bitcoin has gathered such an unconscious force of entrepreneurs and just people of all walks who have entered into the vassalage of Bitcoin that I think it's almost a completely undesignated force at this point.
So I don't want to spend too much time reminiscing on past glory per se.
Sure, yeah. All the glory is ahead of us.
Absolutely.
We shall not rest on our laurels. And even post hyper Bitcoinization, I think a lot of people think that that's the dominant of Bitcoin, but it simply cannot be. That's only the first very simple step to, that's the grading of the playing field. And then from there, that if we actually believe in the civilizational effects of sound money, the work only begins there.
That's actually a very similar line of thinking to the CEO of Bitcoin Magazine, David Bailey. His famous quote is, "Hyper Bitcoinization is when it starts."
Mm-hmm. Precisely. Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with that. Hopefully we can get there.
So you started off, when I kind of talked about the BSG movement, as you're saying, the Bitcoin thesis has really played out since then. I kind of want to talk about how the world has drastically changed since early 2017, kind of during that moment, and talk a little bit about, from an economic perspective, and, again, Yellen saying we shouldn't audit the Fed. Now she's the head of the Treasury. What have we kind of seen since then, and how would you characterize, the Bitcoin thesis playing out?
Well, I guess over the last, Trump had only been president for
4 years.
No, well, then
1 year.
He was there for 1 year. So
I
guess you could say, not to necessarily analogize Trump to Bitcoin, but with the way the system sort of reacts, almost an immunological response to Donald Trump and threat to the model. I think that Donald Trump's experience, it sort of brings to the fore, the whatever you want to call them, it reveals some of the structure of the way the sausage is made. And so to the extent that Bitcoin is an explicit repudiation of that process, I think that the investment case has been made increasingly attractive, in accordance with that.
So let's talk about some of the activity that's happening, right? So in the moment, Janet Yellen is saying we shouldn't audit the Fed. In that very same moment, you were holding up a sign and say buy Bitcoin. And then since then, we've seen M1 money supply go parabolic. We've seen kind of permissions on the banking system really get weaponized severely. They had already been, but even more so. And, now with COVID-19, we're even seeing, even further kind of, let's just call it middlemaning being inserted into any sort of financial activity. And even seeing, financial activity and individuals living here in the U.S. kind of being marginalized to a degree. So, kind of a roundabout question, but let's talk about the underneath kind of things that, you're referencing to when you're saying that it's all coming together and that Bitcoin is shining a light into the inner workings of these systems.
Well, I guess it's the mediation of meaning itself. So, relying on large institutions to tell you what, Twitter deleting shit, Google, banning stuff from search results. It's sort of the digital book burning that goes on is, indicative that whatever Bitcoin is against, it exists because it closely manages the way, the forums that, ideas are generated and that they evolve. So this is the academy, this is, the media in Hollywood or the news media. This is who designs software products that bring us information, and then obviously the whatever political narratives are being workshopped at the time. So fundamentally, Bitcoin as a database, Bitcoin is a database, right? And that database serves information in a manner that's entirely impartial to, it's outside of what you would call that establishment meaning-making system. So when you have that ability to have another star of information on, whatever, who owns a certain set of monetary assets, you can actually anchor a great deal to that.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And I feel like, you're kind of keeping it pretty high level here, but I do kind of want to transition into a little bit of what you are actually working on today. Again, since you're kind of cannonball into the Bitcoin community, you went from a fund and now you're working on technology over at Tlon.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with disintermediating kind of like these communication channels, these kind of these ways for centralized control.
Yeah. So what other Christian,
CK,
older Christian is alluding to is that, now I work at a company called Tlon that is the lead developer of a new operating system called Urbit. And Urbit is, in its most abstract description, a solid state interpreter. But to put a little more description on that, Urbit is a peer-to-peer operating system and network. So what I mean by that is it is a computer, a virtual machine that is designed to make it very easy to operate a personal server. And your server is networked on an internet of other Urbit servers that are also running similar, or the same software. It's open source. It's designed to be, a place where you can serve up your social media information, your blogs, your messages, your photos, your files. Basically, we will be systematically repealing Web 2.0 from our digital lives step by step. So we're starting with messages very concretely. Think of it like a decentralized Slack right now. So we're taking messages, blogging, link sharing collections right now. In a short amount of time, we will be releasing the Bitcoin wallet so that there can be a monetization layer for all of those applications. And then from there on, sky is really the limit. We'll have, audio calling, video calling, document sharing. We'll have a Substack analog. We'll have a Patreon analog. We'll have whatever service you think of now. It can be replicated quite easily on Urbit, and we have a standing invitation to all developers or privacy-minded individuals, people who would feel that their computing experience is particularly maddening, to come try Urbit and give it a whirl and see if we think it's very fertile ground for the next sort of post-cloud megacorp internet.
So kind of, I would say in 2017, if you talk to the average person about the use case and the need for, kind of personal peer-to-peer computing, they would be like, why? Yep. Right? But yep. In 2021, with the deplatforming that has kind of ensued the political situation in the United States, a lot more people are trying to understand why encryption, why self-hosting, why you should, not be dependent on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc.
Sure.
I guess in my mind, obviously, these kind of external factors are a big key to that. But I also personally think that Bitcoin is a key to that too, because Bitcoin makes it really important for you to run your own hardware, for you to manage your own computing stack and to minimize trust.
Right.
Can you just kind of talk about what is evolving here and why is it a fertile ground for Urbit?
Right. So I think I'm basically preaching to the choir to tell the Bitcoin Magazine listeners that, if you don't have equity in the server that is holding your data, it can be, whatever is stored on there can be abused. So if that's a if that's a bank ledger that says you have XYZ amount of credit at a bank, then that's obvious in the monetary example. Urbit basically is, to make a crude analogy, Urbit is to other non-monetary forms of digital content as Bitcoin is to money. So we invite you to basically run a computer that is extremely low cost, low maintenance, that radically minimizes the technical requirements on a user to operate, where you can basically hold your digital life, whatever it is, your messages, your data. We'll call it just that as sort of shorthand for everything that is saved about you on every Web 2 service that you use. Every time you log in, every time you access some data that is ascribed to you as a row in a database, we invite you to get an Urbit and repatriate that data. Close your account, delete your account, store that on a computer that's a server that can give that information out using protocols instead of whatever the business logic is of that company. So this means basically new protocols for messaging, new protocols to transact with. So we're actually not trying to build a new money. So we're importing Bitcoin into the system as the money layer. But for everything else, we want to build, and I'll do the Silicon Valley thing and just use the shorthand word of like protocolize the ways that we communicate online. Unfortunately, you might say, if you're a developer, you'd say, well, what's wrong with all of the current internet protocols? There's dozens of them, and why can't we use those? And the answer is really, the proof is in the pudding. Okay, so you can identify those things. Do you run your own email server? Do you? No, you don't. Okay, and if you don't, why don't you?
I use the Evil Empires.
You use what?
I use the Evil Empires.
Yeah. Well, why do you use Gmail? Why don't you go run your own email server?
Don't know how, and the network effects around Gmail, ease of use.
Yeah, so the network effect definitely, but also just it's extremely difficult to run all these different personal servers. They have to be updated. They have to be you basically have to have the knowledge of a system admin to run an email server, to run whatever it is, an IRC client. Obviously, if you run those services and you're thinking to yourself, oh, but no, it's actually not that hard. Ask yourself, why don't all your friends use IRC? Why? It's just too blanking hard to do all these things, and to have a conglomeration of a lot of different pieces of software that are all on different development timelines, and that all are rather hard to manage. So what Urbit did is it took a look at what we use the personal computer for today, and it basically said, all right, there's 35 years of internet protocols out there it's a total patchwork of protocols. We are going to synthesize all this down to a very simple system, 50,000 lines of code, and it's going to basically work at first as an overlay operating system, so it can run on any Unix machine with an internet connection. And then in the future, because Urbit's architecture is that it's functionally programmed, we'll eventually be able to etch the specification for this computer on a silicon wafer and you can run Urbit on bare metal. And at that point, we'll have, not to prophesize, because prophesizing gets you in trouble, but, we'll have Urbit computers, and that will just be the way. You won't have to be like the crazy person that runs Tails in order to, get some modicum of privacy. It's like, it will just be default. Everyone will do it. And, we'll, as I said, like with regard to hyper Bitcoinization, after hyper Urbitization, then, we can finally, now that we're no longer being, controlled, striated, incentivized by all the different systems we use, we will just have computers again be flat, basic tools. Computers were once described as the bicycle for your mind. And now, they're really more like casino jails. So we'd like to return computers to being flat, boring tools that exist purely in the service of the user.
I mean, while flat, boring tools doesn't sound super exciting to a lot of the folks in Silicon Valley, I think me and you, as people who live here, work here, we've had the experience to see like how broken the incentives are here.
Well, and to your earlier point, of course, this is boring to Silicon Valley. Why? Because you can't monetize it. Sorry. Urbit has no very promising vector for advertising, no promising vector for data extraction, no promising vector for, spam. So it's really, if you're making your buck on the old, like, free product, but we spy on you and we sell your data to advertisers to target AI ads on you, that it's not going to work. Find a new business model. And unfortunately, for most people, this is just going to mean that software is actually, there are more people working in software than need to work in software. It's just the case that, there's probably a lot of just redundant work that's being done right now that if you actually replaced every single selling platform online with one, selling protocol, you would put a lot of engineers at Amazon, Etsy, Shopify, WooCommerce, all of those sites, they'd go out of work. And, then that's an okay thing. Like, this is, Silicon Valley has been, telling truck drivers to learn to code for a while. So now we finally get to tell the Silicon Valley, coders, oh, well, learn to blank, learn to drive a truck.
Okay, so
learn to make wooden furniture.
So I want to dig into this a little bit, because I think there's a lot of symmetries with like kind of what you're describing with, let's just call it an Urbit powered personal computing revolution, to maybe some of the second and third order effects that come from adopting Bitcoin as well.
Yes.
Like, a lot of the issues maybe that we're seeing around Web 2.0 is the fact that the web never had money on it. That there's always there had to be abstractions and permission around transferring value, and that has effectively, created one, misallocation of capital, but two, it created internet-based businesses with kind of weird and broken incentive models.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I guess, what part of that was what originally sort of spurred on the cypherpunks, which is, you look at the set of internet protocols, and yeah, there's no MOIP, money over IP. So what does that look like? Well, now we know, obviously, it's Bitcoin. We've filled in that gap. But now, taking Bitcoin, we look at the rest of the stack and we think, wow, this isn't actually tenable for the average person to run a server. It's far too complicated. So let's boil it down. Let's design a system from the ground up for the specific purpose of making it easy for an individual to run their own personal server. That's the goal.
So what do you think? Like, what do you think needs to happen in the masses' minds to want to do this? Though,
well,
I think it's Bitcoin.
Bitcoin helps, but it's the minority rule dynamic, just like how the minority rule. Like, why is
the intransigent minority?
So why
the tolerant minority?
Exactly. So why is all lemonade kosher?
Why is everything packaged kosher?
Exactly. It's like if Jews are only 3% of the population, why is everything kosher? Well, because they don't buy things that aren't kosher, but Gentiles don't mind drinking kosher things or eating kosher things. So if that effect is playing out right now with Bitcoin, where some people demand Bitcoin, or they demand sound money, eventually the bankers or whatever the mainstream is, the economic mainstream is ambivalent, like, whatever, fiat currency versus Bitcoin, I don't have a strong preference. They'll end up adopting Bitcoin that way anyhow. So similar with the people who feel very strongly that I don't want my data on Google's server. I don't like it when Amazon Alexa listens to me. I don't like all this creepy stuff. I'm going to hold my own data. Eventually that group of people will create their own minority rule effect, where if you want to communicate with the most sort of privacy minded people, which I should, I guess, say are usually like the people that are doing the most, or just sort of entrepreneurially minded. If you want to interact with that crowd, you need to get on this network. You need to acquire Urbit, or this is all purporting that Urbit is like the thing. If there is another thing, I haven't seen it, but.
So this actually kind of leads to my follow-up question, which is, I personally think, like, I've only used Urbit briefly. You're a lot more intimately acquainted with it. I've been really impressed with what I've been seeing so far. And I typically align with the thesis. Like, my thesis is that Bitcoin is the impetus for the personal computing revolution. Everyone's going to run their own server, and that is how we create decentralization. You don't need dApps, you don't need Ethereum, you don't need this stuff. Like, people running their own hardware, that's the revolution. Well, and let me finish. Yeah, sure. We're seeing this like with Bitcoin nodes and Bitcoin hardware wallets and things associated specifically with Bitcoin. And I see that as like fractaling into, people running other services, right? And I'm just kind of curious, like, what's going to cause the network effects to come to new protocols versus people figuring out how to use what's already there and making it easier for individuals?
The fact that it's just not there currently. It's like we've had decades to figure out how to make the internet useful.
But we haven't had Bitcoin. We've had it for 12 years.
Sure. But... And, even then, a pitifully small number of Bitcoin users actually run full nodes. So the pain of operating a personal server is not lost on us. A Bitcoin node is a server, a personal server for the Bitcoin blockchain. It is your personal copy of the Bitcoin blockchain that you serve to other nodes on the network. So, yeah, certainly it's an issue of how do you bootstrap these networks, but obviously they come along because the incentives are overwhelming. Like, what are you going to do? Stay on Twitter for the rest of your life?
It's not sustainable just because Twitter is going to continue to marginalize people, and eventually there's going to be a marginalized group of people that has enough of an audience that it bootstraps another platform.
Yeah. So, on that, I'll say, Urbit is very different. We're not even trying to be like the alt platform, because there are companies that are trying to do that. I'm sure your listeners know them. And without poo-pooing them, it's going to be very hard to replace a centralized service like Twitter with another like alt centralized service. So, Gab or Parler or something like that. It's just, you can't compete sort of head to head. You have to take it one level down the stack and get perhaps to the root issue of, well, why is it the case that a Twitter even exists? Why do we rely on companies like Google, Twitter, Facebook, Amazon to literally just pave a parking lot on top of internet protocols? Why do we have to, fool around on Gmail like it's a sandbox? It's like a simulated network. So when you're on Facebook, they say, oh, Facebook is a social network. No, it's not. It's a social database with a bunch of people on it. The network part is entirely a fabrication. It's not a network at all. It's one node.
Yeah, it's a fabrication of human networks, like flesh networks, and then it synthesizes that data and connections into one, let's just call it cluster of servers that Facebook controls.
Yeah. So we want to return to a true peer-to-peer internet, which was very much the vision of the internet when it was not first created, because that was like the military, but when we had the first days of the personal computer, the internet was in fact quite peer-to-peer. And then as it got monetized, like by companies like AOL, etc., you see people slowly trading their sort of mastery and authorship over their internet experience for just the ease of use. Like, oh yeah, sure, I'll just sign up for the thing. It's like you hardly even bat an eye any longer when you sign up for a new online service. It's just like, oh yeah, sure, add one more. And people are sort of just ambivalent about it, but I don't think you need so many developers trying to architect the ideal way for us to interact online. Like, you want those systems to be flat. It's too important, really. Human communication is too important to leave to some group of engineers that truly engineer behaviors, try to architect your experience in a way that ultimately is to fit the profit motive of their employer.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know this about me, but my very first kind of company I worked at after college was a mobile A/B testing company, and the whole point was, hey, we're reaching out to engineers and be like, get your users to stay on your app longer, get your users to increase their engagement, make sure that daily active users and minutes screen time on app and all of those things are increasing. And we have this technology that's going to let you A/B test the color of their buttons and A/B test all these features and all this stuff, so that way you can make sure your users are engaged and you can continue to extract as much value from your users as possible.
Literally, it's truly perverse, and I would say, of course I don't hold it against you.
I hold it against me. My first two companies before Bitcoin were both manipulate and use data.
Sure. Look, it was people in that paradigm, which we're still in for the most part. There's little imagination for what a different system could look like. And even if there is the idea, just going about the technical specification for what a solution would look like is just, it sort of staggers the mind. So Urbit has actually been in the works for quite a long time, because our founder sort of was able to perceive this problem a long time ago, and he basically worked silently on Urbit for close to a decade, before coming out with Knock, which is the actual mathematical specification for the Urbit computer, which allows it to ultimately be, very simple. Just to gloss over it entirely. If you'd like to learn more about the actual blood and guts of Urbit, I would suggest going to urbit.org, and there's full information on it there. But,
a lot of good interviews that Christian has done with other Bitcoin podcasts as well. I really like the Castle Island Ventures one in particular.
Thank you. Yeah, that's another good Urbit sort of explainer.
Also, plug POV Crypto. That was another solid one. We don't get too into depth on Urbit, but more philosophy. But
sure,
yeah, just keep plugging the pods here.
Keep plugging the pods. I mean, shout out to my man Marty Bent, who will be moderating a panel when we release our Bitcoin wallet next month.
All right.
So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, I guess that's where we're going. We're slowly integrating Bitcoin into Urbit. We're putting first just a basic Bitcoin wallet. Then we're going to put on Lightning. Then, build out, sort of similar features to BTC Pay Server, like, basic storefront stuff. By that point, you'll be able to serve a website from your Urbit. So you could make it, an online store for people on the old web. You can see how the primitives compound very fast with these things. So, please, if you're at all interested, hit me up, and we can get you set up on a brand new Urbit.
Christian hooked it up for your boy, so you can find me on the Urbits.
Yeah, I stick by Urbit as I think it's a good system, and I've certainly enjoyed, getting to use it. And our company basically uses it nearly exclusively for our just internal communications. But I don't expect anyone to take my word for it. It's open source. Go try it out. It works. Urbit works.
Yeah, well, hey, sometimes P2P isn't pretty, but it works, right? And that's kind of like the key. So I kind of want to end the podcast with what's your vision of human life in a world where, maybe we're no longer kind of controlled by our tech overlords, right? Like really the whole point of Urbit, the whole point of Bitcoin is to give the power of living in, cyberspace back to the individual.
Right. Well, I would push back that you even want to live in cyberspace. I mean, I still have the ambition to live in the physical world,
meat space.
So yeah, all of my utopias are, I joke about like utopianism because that's usually where people go wrong. But everyone likes to have their pet utopias. So that for me, that's cathedrals on every horizontal surface in the solar system, and maybe like the Bison Sphere. Shout out to Bitstein and for that one. So yeah, I think that our diversion into sort of cyberspace over the last 2 to 3 decades has really been, it's sort of like when the Gilded Age happened, and for a while there was insane amounts of pollution, but it coincided with moments of immense like industrial growth, and like markets did quite well, etc. And there were positive effects for the physical welfare of humanity. And so I think that the internet thus far has been very good for the informational welfare of humanity, but there always needs to be refinement, and I guess a reification of whatever the original principles of the internet were, enabling human connection ultimately. So that's really what I would like Urbit to enable, and then we can all go outside.
Yeah, make the internet simple and stupid, and make it so we can get out of our cubes and go outside.
Yeah, exactly. Do not eat the bugs. Depart the pod immediately. Go live in a tent and, use Urbit on an e-ink screen, like running on a solar powered tablet or something. This is what I believe.
Yeah, this is the way. All right. Yeah. Well, that you definitely ended it with a vision that I think most people can at least grasp in their head. Christian, want to give you the last word. What you kind of gave the call to action to the audience, but why don't you close it out and tell people where they can learn more as well?
So urbit.org is the main spot. That's Urbit. I'll give Christian a link where you can get on Tlon hosting. So some people use Bitcoin via Coinbase, right? So that's like the centralized vector to scale Bitcoin. So of course, Urbit has its own centralized scaling vector, which is if you don't want to run your Urbit computer yourself, but you can do it on any, laptop or Raspberry Pi. We'll see sort of the Urbit in a box, node in a box form factor popularize more over time. But if you want to just get on Urbit without having to deal with any of that, Tlon will run an Urbit node for you. It will still have pretty good privacy guarantees, and you'll retain the private keys to your Urbit. But that's also available, so you can try that, and I'll give you a link for signing up for that. I'm on Twitter under a few names, so you can search those down. They're not too hard to find. Just search Christian Langalis. You'll probably find something. And our Bitcoin wallet is coming out. The demo is on April 27th. So you can find that on the meetup page for Urbit. And then I'll also be in Miami.
Let's go.
It's about to throw down.
Dude.
So
200K party, baby.
Yeah, seriously. So I'm very pleased to be back in the physical presence of Bitcoiners.
Yeah, man. Like I said, this was the first in-flesh interview I've done in over a year.
We'll continue our jolly mission hand in hand.
Let's go. Well, hey, Miami is going to be absolutely incredible. Christian is going to be on stage giving a demonstration of Urbit and the Bitcoin functionality in particular. So if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, promo code Satoshi. Let's get your ass to Miami. We're going to sell out. It's going to be incredible.
Let's do it. Christian, thanks for having me on.
You got it, man. Peace.
Ciao, ciao.
A quick reminder that all of the content in this episode is for informational and entertainment purposes only. You should not construe the information as legal, tax, investment, financial, or any other advice. Nothing contained in this presentation constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, or offer by BTC Media, the Let's Talk Bitcoin podcast network, or any third-party service provider to buy or sell securities or any other financial instruments. Do your own research.